Waking up every day with a clear sense of purpose, not shaken by setbacks, not pulled by the chaos around you, and fully focused on what actually matters. It almost sounds unrealistic, like it belongs to a different kind of person. But it doesn't. That level of control isn't about being extraordinary. It comes down to seeing something most people miss. Because the real struggle isn't a lack of discipline, it's a lack of direction beneath it. There's a reason the ideas of Marcus Aurelius still hold weight centuries later. Stoicism was never about escaping life or suppressing emotion. It was about clarity, seeing what deserves your energy and what doesn't. And when that becomes clear, discipline changes. It stops feeling forced. It becomes alignment, a quiet, steady way of moving through life without constantly working against yourself. And once that shift begins, something else follows. The noise starts to lose its grip. Decisions become simpler, not easier, but clearer. You stop chasing everything at once and start moving with intention. And in that space, something stronger begins to take shape. Not motivation, not intensity, but a form of discipline that actually holds. Everything begins with a simple but uncomfortable realization. Not everything deserves your effort. It sounds obvious, but look closely at how most days unfold. Small distractions feel urgent. Notifications feel important. Other people's expectations quietly become priorities. And before you notice it, your energy is gone, but nothing meaningful has moved forward. That's a different kind of exhaustion. Not from doing too much, but from doing too much of what doesn't matter. When clarity is missing, everything feels important. That's the trap. You respond to whatever is loudest, whatever shows up first. It feels productive, but it isn't direction. It's reaction. And over time, that becomes costly. You move more, but you don't move forward. Effort increases, but results don't. And the frustration builds, not because you're lazy, but because something deeper isn't aligned. So the real starting point isn't action, it's clarity. It's stepping back, even briefly, and asking what actually deserves your time and energy. Not based on pressure or comparison, but on what genuinely matters when everything else is stripped away. That question isn't comfortable because it forces you to see how much of your life might be running on autopilot. But it's necessary, because without that honesty, discipline becomes reactive instead of intentional. You don't choose your actions, they choose you. And once you see that clearly, something begins to shift. You stop trying to do everything. You start focusing on what matters. And that focus creates space. Space where discipline can actually grow instead of being constantly scattered. Once that clarity begins to settle, something quieter reveals itself. The pull toward distraction, the subtle urge to move away from what requires effort and toward what feels easier. It doesn't come from outside, it comes from you. And that's what makes it difficult to recognize, because it feels natural. It feels like your own voice guiding you. But when you don't notice it, you stop choosing, you start reacting. You delay what matters, you avoid discomfort, you follow impulses that pull you away from your direction. And over time, those small moments begin to define your days. That's why the pause matters. Even a brief moment where you don't immediately act, where you notice the impulse instead of following it. Because in that space, something important happens. You regain choice. That pause is where discipline starts to take shape, not through intensity, but through awareness. You begin to see that not every thought needs to be followed, not every feeling needs to be acted on, and that realization creates distance, enough distance to choose differently. At first, it feels unnatural. The mind is persuasive. It can justify almost anything in the moment. It tells you to wait, to delay, to take the easier path. And those arguments sound reasonable. But over time, you start to recognize them for what they are: patterns. And once you see the pattern, it becomes easier to step outside of it. That's how trust begins to build, not through thinking differently, but through acting differently. through small moments where you follow through, even when it would be easier not to. It doesn't happen all at once. It's built through repetition, through showing up in ways that feel insignificant at the time, doing what you said you would do, even when no one is watching, especially then. Because discipline isn't proven in intensity, it's proven in consistency. And consistency is quiet. It doesn't feel impressive. It doesn't give you instant results. But over time, it changes something deeper. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop needing constant reminders. The decision has already been made, and your role is simply to follow through. Slowly, effort turns into identity. You're no longer someone who tries, you're someone who shows up. But consistency alone isn't enough if everything stays within comfort, because comfort has limits. It keeps things stable, but it doesn't expand them. That's why stepping into discomfort on purpose becomes necessary. Not extreme hardship, not punishment, but controlled difficulty. Choosing the harder option when the easier one is available. Staying with something a little longer than you want to. Because when you stop avoiding discomfort, it stops controlling your decisions. And that changes how you approach everything. Challenges stop feeling like obstacles and start feeling like opportunities to expand what you're capable of handling. At that point, your perspective on challenges begins to shift. You don't just see them as problems, you see them as feedback. A way to observe how you think, how you react, what you default to under pressure. And that awareness leads to something deeper. Not everything deserves your energy. Some things are outside your control, and trying to manage them only drains you. When you let go of what you can't control, your focus sharpens. You direct your energy toward your actions, your responses, your decisions. And that focus creates stability. You're no longer pulled in every direction by outcomes or opinions. You stay centered in what you do. That stability changes how effort feels. You're not constantly reacting. You're acting with intention. Your energy isn't diluted by frustration or expectation. It becomes direct. And because of that, it becomes more effective. You're no longer tied to immediate results. You're focused on the process, on showing up, on staying aligned. And that creates a kind of confidence that doesn't depend on external validation. It comes from knowing you can rely on yourself, that no matter what happens, you'll continue moving in the direction you've chosen. Even then, the noise doesn't disappear. Opinions, doubts, criticism, sometimes from others, sometimes from your own mind. But not every voice deserves influence. Some thoughts are reactions, not truth. Some opinions are distractions, not guidance, and learning to filter that noise becomes part of discipline. You don't follow everything you hear, you observe it, and you choose whether it aligns with what matters. And that choice protects your focus. It keeps your direction stable, even when everything around you is uncertain. That's where reflection becomes essential, not occasional, but consistent. Taking time to look back, not to judge yourself, but to understand yourself. Where did you act with intention? Where did you drift? What pulled you off course? What strengthened your focus? These questions create awareness, and awareness creates change. Because once you see your patterns clearly, you can begin to adjust them. Not all at once, but gradually. And those small adjustments, repeated over time, reshape how you move through your life. And eventually, something becomes clear. Discipline isn't about restriction, it's about alignment. When your actions reflect what you truly value, discipline stops feeling forced. It becomes natural. You don't rely on motivation anymore because you've built something deeper, a structure that holds even when everything else feels uncertain. And once you experience that, you don't want to go back. Because for the first time, you're not reacting to life, you're directing it. If this way of thinking resonates with you, then this is your moment to act on it. Not just to listen, but to commit. Subscribing here is about choosing to return to this mindset again and again, A reminder to stay clear, to stay intentional, and to keep building that inner discipline that most people never take the time to develop. At first it looks harmless, checking something quickly, putting something off for later, choosing the easier option just this once. Each moment feels small, almost insignificant, but over time, those small moments begin to stack. They create patterns, and those patterns shape your days in ways you don't immediately notice. You still feel like you're in control, you still believe you're choosing, but in reality, you're reacting, moving from one impulse to the next, without ever stopping long enough to question where those impulses are leading you. That's where the danger sits, not in the distraction itself, but in how automatic it becomes. When something happens repeatedly without awareness, it stops feeling like a choice. It feels like a default. And once it becomes a default, it starts to define your behavior. You reach for your phone without thinking. You avoid difficult tasks without questioning why. You delay things that matter, not because you've decided to, but because something in you is trying to escape the discomfort attached to them. It's subtle, but it's powerful. And the more this pattern repeats, the harder it becomes to break. Not because you lack discipline, but because you've trained yourself to respond this way. You've reinforced the habit of avoiding discomfort. You've practiced distraction. You've built a system where ease is prioritized over meaning, and systems once established don't change on their own. They continue running until something interrupts them. That interruption doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be as simple as a pause, just a moment where you don't immediately act on what you feel, a moment where you notice the impulse instead of following it. That space is small, but it changes everything, because in that space you begin to see clearly. You recognize that the urge you're feeling isn't necessarily something you need to obey. It's just a signal, a suggestion, and suggestions can be accepted or rejected. This is where awareness starts to replace automatic behavior. You begin to see how often your actions are driven by the desire to avoid discomfort rather than pursue what matters. You notice the patterns, the moments where you shift your focus not because you've decided to, but because something feels slightly difficult or inconvenient. And once you see it, it becomes harder to ignore. That awareness creates a kind of friction, but it's a useful kind. It slows you down just enough to make a different choice possible. It also reveals something important about discipline. It's not just about doing what's hard. It's about recognizing why something feels hard in the first place. Often, it's not the task itself. It's the resistance around it, the hesitation, the internal dialogue that tries to convince you to delay, to avoid, to wait until you feel more ready. But readiness rarely arrives on its own. It follows action, not the other way around. And when you start to understand that, the need to wait begins to lose its hold. Over time, this practice of pausing becomes more natural. You don't react as quickly. You observe more. And in that observation, you gain a level of control that wasn't there before. Not control over your thoughts or feelings, but control over how you respond to them. That distinction matters, because you can't stop impulses from appearing, but you can decide whether they guide your actions or not. This is where Stoic thinking aligns closely with modern psychology. Both recognize that awareness is the foundation of change. Without it, behavior remains unconscious. With it, even deeply ingrained habits can begin to shift. Epictetus captured this idea simply when he said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." That mastery doesn't come from suppressing impulses. It comes from understanding them, seeing them clearly, and choosing not to be ruled by them. As this awareness deepens, something else begins to change. The intensity of the impulses starts to weaken. Not because they disappear, but because they lose their authority. They no longer feel like commands, they feel like options. And when something becomes an option instead of a command, you regain the ability to choose based on what actually matters, not just what feels easiest in the moment. That shift is subtle, but it's significant. It marks the point where discipline starts to move from effort to understanding. You're no longer fighting yourself constantly. You're working with a clearer view of how your mind operates, and that clarity makes consistency more achievable, not because things get easier, but because you're no longer being pulled in directions you didn't consciously choose. It also brings a certain calm, a sense that you're not at the mercy of every passing thought or feeling. You can sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. You can stay with a task even when your mind suggests something else. And in those moments, you begin to experience a different kind of strength. Not loud or visible, but steady, reliable. And as that steadiness grows, it reinforces everything that comes after. Because discipline, at its core, isn't about forcing action. It's about creating enough space between impulse and response that your actions become intentional. That space is where control lives, and once you learn to access it, even briefly, you start to realize how much of your behavior was never truly yours to begin with. That pause, small as it seems, is where everything begins to change. Not in some dramatic, life-altering moment, but in something far quieter. A hesitation, a brief space between what you feel and what you do. Most people overlook it because it doesn't feel significant. It doesn't look like progress. But that space is where discipline starts to take shape. Not as force, not as resistance, but as awareness. The ability to see what's happening inside you before you immediately react to it. The mind doesn't make this process easy either. It's persuasive. It can justify almost anything if given enough space. It tells you that this one time doesn't matter, that you'll start later, that you deserve a break. And in the moment, those arguments feel reasonable, logical even. That's what makes them effective. They don't appear as obstacles. They appear as solutions. And if you're not paying attention, you follow them without question. This is where trust becomes important. Not trust in how you feel, because feelings shift constantly. Not trust in motivation, because motivation fades. But trust in something deeper, your judgment. Your ability to recognize what actually matters and act accordingly, even when it's not convenient. That kind of trust doesn't appear overnight. It's built, slowly, through repeated moments where you choose alignment over ease. But before that trust can exist, there's usually a gap between what you know you should do and what you actually do. That gap is where most frustration lives. You see the difference, you feel it, and over time, it can create doubt. Not just in your discipline, but in yourself. You start to question whether you're capable of consistency, whether you can actually follow through on what you decide. The truth is, that gap isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign of awareness. It means you've reached a point where you can see the difference between intention and action. And while that awareness can feel uncomfortable, it's necessary, because without it, there's nothing to adjust, no point of reference. You continue moving without realizing you're off course. But once you see it, you have a choice. You can ignore it, or you can start closing that gap, one decision at a time. Closing that gap doesn't require dramatic changes. It doesn't require perfect consistency. It starts with small, deliberate actions, moments where you follow through, even when it would be easier not to. Moments where you stay with something slightly longer than you want to. These actions don't feel significant in isolation, but they accumulate, and over time, they begin to reshape how you see yourself. That's where trust starts to form. Not from thinking differently, but from acting differently. Each time you follow through, you reinforce a pattern. You show yourself that your decisions have weight, that your intentions aren't empty, and slowly that changes the internal dialogue. The doubt begins to quiet. The hesitation loses some of its strength, because you've created evidence, not through words, but through action. At the same time, this process requires patience, because the mind doesn't change instantly. It resists, it looks for shortcuts, it tries to pull you back into familiar patterns. That's part of its nature. It prefers what it knows, even if what it knows isn't helpful. So when you start to shift your behavior, there's friction. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something new. That friction is easy to misinterpret. It can feel like resistance, like a sign that you should stop or slow down. But in reality, it's often a sign that something is changing, that you're stepping outside of patterns that have been reinforced over time, and that's not supposed to feel comfortable. Growth rarely does. But discomfort in this context isn't something to avoid. It's something to understand. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That idea sits at the center of this process, because what you're doing in these moments of pause is exactly that, bringing awareness to what was previously automatic. You're seeing the patterns, the impulses, the justifications, and once they're visible, they lose some of their control. Over time, this awareness becomes more consistent. You don't need to force the pause as much. It begins to happen naturally. You notice the impulse as it appears. You recognize the familiar patterns, and instead of being pulled by them, you observe them. That observation creates space, and in that space, better decisions become possible. This doesn't mean the impulses disappear. They don't. The mind continues to suggest easier paths, quicker rewards, immediate comfort. But the difference is, you're no longer automatically following those suggestions. You're choosing. And that choice, repeated over time, becomes the foundation of discipline. It also changes how you experience yourself. You begin to see that you're not defined by every thought or feeling that arises. You don't have to act on everything you experience. There's a separation, a sense that you can observe without immediately reacting. And that separation creates stability, because you're no longer being pushed in every direction by whatever shows up internally. And as that stability grows, so does confidence. Not the kind that relies on external validation, but a quieter form. The kind that comes from knowing you can rely on yourself, that when you decide something matters, you'll follow through. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to trust the direction you're moving in. That's where discipline starts to feel different. Less like something you're forcing, more like something you're becoming. It's no longer about controlling every action. It's about understanding the process behind those actions. And once you understand that process, you stop fighting yourself as much. You start working with that awareness instead. And it all comes back to that pause, that small moment that most people ignore. The space where awareness enters, where choice becomes possible, where discipline quietly begins to take form, not as something imposed from the outside, but as something built from within. It doesn't arrive all at once. There's no moment where everything suddenly clicks and discipline becomes effortless. It builds slowly, almost quietly, through repetition, through showing up in ways that feel small, sometimes even meaningless in the moment. Doing what you said you would do, even when the result isn't immediate, even when no one notices. Especially then, because those are the moments that shape something deeper than outcomes. They shape how you see yourself. At first, it doesn't feel like much is happening. You follow through on something simple, and the day moves on. No reward, no recognition, just another action completed. And it's easy to overlook that. Easy to assume that real progress should feel bigger, more visible. But that expectation is part of the problem. It pulls your attention toward intensity instead of consistency, toward moments that feel significant rather than patterns that actually are. Consistency doesn't feel impressive. It doesn't create a rush. It doesn't give you a strong sense of achievement right away. It's repetitive, predictable, sometimes even boring. And because of that, most people struggle with it. They chase variation, excitement, something that feels different. But discipline isn't built in variation. It's built in repetition, in doing the same thing again, even when it doesn't feel new. That's where resistance starts to show up, not as something dramatic, but as a quiet voice suggesting that it doesn't matter if you skip this once, that you've done enough, that you can afford to take a break. And in isolation, those thoughts seem reasonable, but over time they create a pattern where your actions depend on how you feel in the moment rather than what you've decided actually matters. Breaking that pattern doesn't require forcing yourself into extremes. It requires something much simpler and at the same time much harder. Following through, repeatedly, even when the action feels small, even when it doesn't feel urgent, even when there's no external pressure pushing you to do it, because that's where consistency is tested, not when it's easy, but when it's optional. There's something important that begins to shift when you start doing this. You stop negotiating with yourself as much. The internal back and forth begins to quiet down, not because the thoughts disappear, but because they lose influence. You've created a pattern of action that doesn't rely on constant justification. You do what you said you would do, not because you feel like it, but because you've decided it matters. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once your actions are no longer tied to your mood, they become more stable, more reliable. You don't need to constantly motivate yourself. You don't need to convince yourself every time. The decision has already been made, and your role is simply to follow through on it. Over time, that consistency starts to build something deeper than just results. It builds identity. You begin to see yourself differently, not as someone who tries, but as someone who follows through. And that distinction matters, because identity shapes behavior more strongly than intention ever could. When you believe something about yourself, your actions begin to align with that belief, often without conscious effort. This is why small actions matter so much, not because of what they produce immediately, but because of what they reinforce. Each time you show up, you're sending a message to yourself about who you are, about what you value, about what you're capable of maintaining over time. And those messages accumulate. They form a pattern, and that pattern becomes your baseline. There's no need for dramatic change when this process is in place. You don't need to constantly push yourself harder or aim for more intensity, because consistency compounds. What feels small today doesn't stay small. It builds, quietly, gradually, and before you notice it, something that once required effort starts to feel natural. Seneca expressed this idea simply when he said, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." Preparation, in this sense, isn't about waiting for something big. It's about consistently doing what matters, regardless of whether an opportunity is visible yet. Because when it does appear, you're ready, not because you rushed to prepare, but because you've been preparing all along. This also changes how you view progress. Instead of looking for immediate results, you start to pay attention to patterns, to whether you're showing up, whether you're following through, whether your actions are aligned with your intentions over time. And that perspective creates a different kind of satisfaction, one that isn't dependent on outcomes, but on consistency. There's a certain quiet confidence that comes from this, not loud, not visible, but steady. The kind that doesn't need validation, because it's built on something real, on repeated action, on follow-through, on proof that you can rely on yourself, even in small ways. And that confidence becomes a foundation, something you can build on. At the same time, this process requires patience, because results don't always show up immediately. And when they don't, it's easy to question whether what you're doing is working. But that doubt is part of the process. It's what tests whether your actions are truly aligned with your values or just dependent on visible outcomes. Staying consistent through that uncertainty is what strengthens discipline. Not just doing the action, but continuing to do it without immediate reinforcement. Because that's where most people stop. They need to see something happening. They need proof. And when it's not there, they lose momentum. But if you can continue anyway, something deeper starts to form. Effort begins to feel different, less forced, less dependent on external factors, more internal, more stable. You're no longer reacting to what's happening around you. You're acting based on what you've already decided matters. And that creates a kind of independence from mood, from circumstances, from temporary motivation. And in that quiet repetition, something fundamental changes. You stop seeing discipline as something separate from yourself. It's no longer a tool you use occasionally. It becomes part of who you are, built slowly, reinforced daily, and held together not by intensity, but by consistency. Consistency builds a foundation, but if everything you do stays within the boundaries of comfort, that foundation only reaches a certain height. It stabilizes what already exists, but it doesn't expand it. Comfort has a quiet way of setting limits without announcing them. It feels safe, familiar, even productive at times. You can stay consistent within comfort and still feel like you're doing enough. But over time, something starts to feel stagnant. Not because you've stopped moving, but because you've stopped stretching. The problem with comfort isn't that it's bad, it's that it becomes the default. You begin to choose it automatically without noticing the trade-off. Easier options become more appealing, more justified. You tell yourself it doesn't matter this time, that you've earned it, that it won't make a difference. And once again, each moment feels small. But just like with distraction, those small choices accumulate. They form patterns, and those patterns slowly define the limits of your growth. This is why discomfort plays such a critical role in discipline. Not extreme discomfort, not pushing yourself into exhaustion or punishment, but deliberate, controlled exposure to difficulty, choosing something slightly harder when an easier option is available, staying in a task a little longer than you want to, taking the step you'd normally avoid. These actions don't feel significant at the time, but they create something important. They expand your capacity. At first, discomfort feels like resistance, something to move away from. It creates tension, hesitation, even doubt. The mind starts offering alternatives, easier paths, more comfortable options. And if you're not paying attention, you follow them without question. But when you begin to stay with that discomfort, even briefly, something changes. You realize that it doesn't break you, it doesn't overwhelm you, it passes. And in that realization, its power begins to fade. That shift is important, because once discomfort is no longer something you automatically avoid, it stops controlling your decisions. It becomes just another experience, not something that dictates your behavior. And when that happens, you gain a kind of freedom. You're no longer limited by what feels easy. You can choose based on what matters, not just what feels comfortable in the moment. This also changes how you approach challenges. Instead of seeing them as obstacles, you begin to see them as opportunities to expand your limits. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, consistent ways. Each time you step into discomfort, you reinforce the idea that you can handle more than you thought. And that reinforcement builds confidence, not from success, but from experience. Over time, this creates a different relationship with effort. It stops feeling like something you need to avoid or minimize. It becomes something you engage with more willingly. Because you understand its role, you see how it contributes to growth. And that understanding reduces resistance. You're not forcing yourself into discomfort anymore. You're choosing it, knowing what it leads to. There's also a deeper layer to this. Discomfort often reveals things you wouldn't otherwise notice. Your reactions, your limits, your patterns. When everything is easy, those things stay hidden. But when you step into difficulty, they become visible. And that visibility is valuable. It gives you insight. It shows you where you can improve, where you tend to pull back, where your boundaries actually are. Seneca captured this idea when he said, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." Strength in this sense isn't built through avoidance. It's built through exposure, through engagement, through choosing to face what's slightly beyond your current level of comfort. And just like physical strength, it develops gradually, one repetition at a time. As this process continues, something subtle begins to change in how you see yourself. You no longer identify as someone who avoids difficulty. You begin to see yourself as someone who can handle it, and that shift in identity influences your actions. You start to approach situations differently, with less hesitation, with more willingness to engage. This doesn't mean discomfort becomes enjoyable. It doesn't, but it becomes manageable, familiar. You recognize it for what it is, a signal that you're stepping into something that has the potential to expand you. And instead of pulling back, you lean into it, even if just slightly. At the same time, this practice requires balance. It's not about constantly pushing yourself to extremes. It's about choosing your moments, knowing when to step forward and when to recover. Because sustainable discipline isn't built on burnout. It's built on consistency paired with intentional challenge. That balance allows you to maintain momentum. You're not overwhelming yourself, but you're also not staying stagnant. You're moving forward, gradually increasing your capacity without breaking your foundation. And that steady progression is what leads to lasting change. Eventually, the things that once felt uncomfortable begin to feel normal, not because they've changed, but because you have. Your tolerance has expanded, your perspective has shifted, and what once required effort now feels more natural. That's how growth happens, not in sudden leaps, but in gradual adjustments. And as that growth continues, the grip of comfort weakens. It no longer dictates your choices. It becomes just one factor among many, not the deciding one. You can choose difficulty when it aligns with your goals, and comfort when it serves your recovery. That flexibility is a form of control. In the end, stepping into discomfort isn't about proving something. It's about expanding what's possible for you. It's about removing the limits that comfort quietly imposes. And once those limits begin to fade, you start to see how much more you're capable of handling, how much further you can go, and how discipline, when paired with intentional challenge, becomes something far more powerful than simple consistency alone. This shift is quiet, but it changes everything. Instead of asking why something is happening, your attention turns inward. You begin to notice your reactions more than the circumstances. The frustration, the urge to resist, the need for things to be different than they are. And in noticing these responses, you start to see patterns that were always there but rarely observed. The way you default under pressure, the way your mind interprets difficulty, the way you either engage or withdraw. That awareness introduces a new perspective. Challenges are no longer just things to overcome. They become opportunities to observe yourself in real time, to see what you've built internally and where it still needs work. Not as a judgment, but as information, because without that observation, growth remains abstract. You can think you're disciplined, but until you're tested, it remains an idea. And tests don't arrive in controlled conditions. They appear in moments you didn't plan for. This is where the idea of control becomes central. Not control over what happens, but control over how you respond to what happens. It's a distinction that sounds simple, but carries a lot of weight. Because most of the energy people spend during challenges isn't directed at their response. It's directed at the situation itself, trying to change it, resist it, wishing it were different. And while that reaction is natural, it's also draining. Because much of what happens is outside your influence. Recognizing that isn't about becoming passive, it's about becoming precise, understanding where your energy actually has an effect and where it doesn't. Because when you try to control what you can't, you spread yourself thin. Your attention fragments, your effort loses direction, and instead of strengthening your response, you weaken it by dividing it across things that don't move. Letting go of what you can't control isn't easy. It goes against instinct. The mind wants to fix, to adjust, to make things align with its expectations. But over time, that effort creates tension, a constant sense of resistance. And that resistance doesn't solve the problem, it amplifies it. Because now you're dealing with both the situation and your reaction to it. When you begin to release that need for control over external things, something shifts internally. There's less friction, less wasted energy. You're no longer trying to manage everything at once. Instead, your focus narrows. It becomes directed toward what you can actually influence, your thoughts, your actions, your decisions, and that focus creates clarity. That clarity allows you to respond more effectively. Not because the situation changes, but because your relationship to it does. You're not reacting from frustration or urgency. You're acting from a place of awareness. You see what's happening, and you choose how to engage with it. That choice, even if small, creates stability. Epictetus captured this idea in a way that remains as relevant now as it was then. Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens. There's a simplicity to that, but also a depth. It's not about ignoring reality. It's about engaging with it in a way that preserves your energy and directs it where it matters most. As this perspective becomes more consistent, challenges begin to feel different, less overwhelming, more structured. You still experience difficulty, but it doesn't pull you in as many directions. You don't get caught in every reaction. You observe more. You respond with intention. And that changes the outcome, not always externally, but internally. This internal shift is what strengthens discipline over time. Not the absence of difficulty, but the ability to navigate it without losing alignment, to stay grounded in your actions, even when circumstances are unstable. And that kind of stability isn't built through avoidance. It's built through repeated exposure, paired with awareness. At the same time, this approach reduces unnecessary stress. Because you're no longer carrying the weight of things you can't change. You're not replaying situations endlessly, trying to find a different version of events. You accept what is and direct your energy toward what can be done now. That acceptance isn't passive, it's efficient. Over time, this becomes a habit. You start to naturally filter situations through this lens. What is within my control? What isn't? And once that distinction is clear, your response follows more easily. You don't get pulled into every emotional reaction. You maintain a level of distance that allows for better judgment. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care differently, with more precision, more intention. You invest your energy where it has impact, and you release it where it doesn't. And that balance creates a kind of resilience that isn't dependent on circumstances. In the end, the shift isn't about removing challenges. It's about changing how you engage with them, seeing them not as obstacles to avoid, but as opportunities to refine your response, to strengthen your discipline, to reinforce your alignment. And in that process, you realize that control was never about the outside. It was always about how you choose to meet it. That kind of focus creates something most people spend years searching for without ever fully understanding. A sense of stability that doesn't depend on what's happening around you. Not the kind that comes from controlling everything, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to. Because once your attention shifts toward your actions instead of outcomes, something begins to settle. You stop being pulled in multiple directions at once. You stop reacting to every change, every opinion, every unexpected result. And in that stillness, your effort becomes clearer. When that begins to fade, your actions become more direct. You do what needs to be done without constantly questioning the outcome. Not because you don't care about results, but because you understand that results aren't something you can fully control. They're influenced by too many variables, too many factors outside your reach. And once that becomes clear, your relationship with effort changes. You stop attaching your sense of progress to immediate outcomes. You stop measuring every action by what it produces right away. Instead, your attention stays with the action itself, the quality of it, the consistency of it. And that shift removes a lot of unnecessary pressure. because you're no longer trying to control something that was never fully yours to control in the first place. This doesn't make you passive. It does the opposite. It allows you to engage more fully with what you're doing, without distraction, without hesitation, without constantly looking ahead to see what might happen next. Your effort becomes more focused, more intentional, and because of that, it becomes more effective. There's a certain calm that comes with this way of operating, not a lack of ambition, but a different kind of it. One that isn't driven by urgency or anxiety, but by clarity. You know what needs to be done, and you do it. Not because you're chasing a specific outcome, but because the action itself aligns with your direction. Over time, this creates a sense of reliability. You begin to trust your own process, not because it guarantees a specific result, but because it's consistent. You show up, you follow through, you stay aligned, and that consistency builds something deeper than success. It builds confidence. This confidence isn't loud. It doesn't depend on external validation. It's quieter than that, more stable. It comes from knowing that regardless of what happens, you'll continue to act in a way that reflects what matters to you, and that kind of certainty removes a lot of internal conflict. You no longer need constant reassurance. You don't need to check whether you're on the right path every few moments, because your actions already reflect your direction. You're not waiting for confirmation. You're creating it through what you do. Marcus Aurelius expressed this idea clearly when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That strength doesn't come from controlling outcomes. It comes from controlling your response to them, from maintaining your focus regardless of what's happening externally. As this mindset becomes more consistent, something else begins to shift. The influence of external opinions starts to fade. Not because they disappear, but because they no longer carry the same weight. You're not basing your actions on approval or criticism. You're basing them on alignment. And that makes your decisions more stable. This stability allows you to move forward without constant hesitation. You're not second-guessing every step. You're not adjusting your direction based on every piece of feedback. You listen, you observe, but you don't lose your center. And that's what keeps your progress steady. At the same time, this approach reduces emotional volatility. Because you're not tying your effort to specific outcomes, you're less affected when things don't go as planned. You adjust, you continue, but you don't collapse. Your sense of direction remains intact. That resilience is what makes this kind of discipline sustainable. It doesn't rely on perfect conditions. It doesn't depend on everything going right. It holds even when things are uncertain. And that consistency over time creates momentum. You start to notice that progress feels different, less dramatic, but more reliable. You're not relying on bursts of motivation or moments of intensity. You're building something steady, something that continues regardless of how you feel on any given day. And that steadiness changes how you experience effort. It stops feeling like something you have to force. It becomes something you return to, a process you trust, a rhythm you maintain. And in that rhythm, discipline becomes less about control and more about alignment. There's also a sense of freedom in this, because when you're no longer attached to every outcome, you're less restricted by fear of failure or need for success. You can act more openly, more honestly. You're not holding back because of what might happen. You're moving forward because of what you've chosen to do. This doesn't remove uncertainty. It changes your relationship to it. You accept that outcomes will vary, that things won't always go as expected. But that acceptance doesn't weaken your effort. It strengthens it, because your focus remains where it has impact. Even with that growing clarity, the noise doesn't disappear. It never really does. It just changes form. Sometimes it comes from other people, opinions, expectations, judgments that arrive uninvited and linger longer than they should. Other times, it comes from within. Doubt that sounds convincing. Thoughts that question your direction. subtle suggestions that maybe you should adjust, slow down, or rethink everything you've already committed to. And because this noise doesn't always feel external, it becomes harder to separate from your own voice. At first, it's easy to assume that every thought deserves attention, that if something appears in your mind, it must have value. But that assumption is what gives noise its power. It blurs the line between what matters and what doesn't, between what aligns with your direction and what simply distracts you from it. And over time, if you don't question that distinction, you start to treat every voice as equally important. That's where discipline starts to weaken again. Not because you've lost your ability to act, but because your focus becomes divided. You begin to second-guess decisions that were once clear. You hesitate where you once moved forward. You adjust your path based on temporary thoughts or external opinions that don't actually reflect your values. And in doing so, you slowly move away from the very clarity you worked to build. This is why not every voice deserves influence. Some thoughts are reactions, not reflections. They appear in response to discomfort, uncertainty, or fear. They don't come from a place of understanding. They come from a desire to avoid. And if you follow them without questioning, they lead you away from what actually matters. The same applies to external opinions. Not all criticism is useful. Not all advice is relevant. Some of it is based on perspectives that don't align with your direction. Some of it is shaped by experiences that aren't yours. And some of it is simply noise, unfiltered, unexamined, and not worth carrying. Recognizing this doesn't mean ignoring everything. It means becoming selective, developing the ability to filter what you hear, both internally and externally. To pause and ask whether a thought or opinion aligns with what you've already identified as important. And if it doesn't, allowing yourself to let it pass without giving it weight. This kind of filtering requires clarity, but it also requires confidence. Not the kind that assumes you're always right, but the kind that trusts your direction enough to not be constantly swayed by every new input. Because without that trust, you become reactive again. You adjust too quickly, you lose consistency, and your actions start reflecting noise instead of intention. There's also a deeper layer to this. Much of the internal noise you experience isn't random. It's shaped by past experiences, by patterns that have been reinforced over time. Doubt, hesitation, self-criticism, these aren't isolated thoughts. They're part of a larger system, and understanding that system helps you see those thoughts more clearly. Carl Jung pointed to this when he said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The same applies internally. The thoughts that disturb you, that create friction, often reveal something deeper. Not something you need to obey, but something you can observe, something you can learn from without being controlled by it. As you begin to observe these patterns, the noise starts to lose its intensity, not because it disappears, but because you see it differently. You recognize that not every thought reflects truth. Not every opinion reflects value, and that recognition creates distance, enough distance to choose your response instead of reacting automatically. This doesn't make the process easy. The noise can still be persistent, it can still sound convincing, but it no longer has the same authority. You're no longer assuming that everything you hear deserves action. You're evaluating it, filtering it, deciding whether it aligns with your direction or not. And that decision-making process becomes faster over time. You don't need to analyze every thought in detail. You develop a sense of what fits and what doesn't, what supports your path and what pulls you away from it. And that sense creates stability. At the same time, this approach protects your focus. Because once you stop giving attention to everything, your energy becomes more concentrated. You're not constantly shifting directions. You're not adjusting based on every new input. You're moving forward with intention, guided by something deeper than temporary noise. There's also a sense of freedom in this. Because when external opinions lose their authority, you're less dependent on validation. You're not looking for constant approval. You're not measuring your actions against what others think you should be doing. You're acting based on what you've already determined matters. This doesn't isolate you. It grounds you. It allows you to engage with others without losing your center, to listen without being swayed unnecessarily, to consider feedback without abandoning your direction. And that balance is what keeps your discipline intact. Over time, this becomes part of how you operate. You don't react to every thought. You don't follow every opinion. You observe, you filter, and you choose. And that process reinforces your clarity. It strengthens your alignment. It keeps your actions consistent with what you've already decided matters. And in that consistency, the noise becomes less disruptive. It's still there, but it no longer defines your movement. It becomes background instead of direction, something you're aware of, but not controlled by. Because in the end, discipline isn't just about what you do. It's also about what you ignore, what you choose not to follow, what you allow to pass without influence. And once you develop that ability, your focus becomes stronger, your actions more intentional, and your direction far more stable. That's where reflection begins to take on a different kind of importance. Not as something you do occasionally when things go wrong, but as a steady practice that keeps you aligned over time. It doesn't need to be complicated or time-consuming. It's simply a moment where you step back and look at how your day actually unfolded. Not the version you intended, not the version you hoped for, but what truly happened. The decisions you made, the moments you followed through, and the ones where you didn't. At first, this kind of reflection can feel uncomfortable because it removes the distance between your intentions and your actions. It shows you clearly where they match and where they don't. And that clarity can be difficult to face. It's easier to stay in motion, to keep moving forward without looking back. But without that pause, patterns remain hidden. And what remains hidden continues to repeat. The purpose of reflection isn't to criticize yourself. It's not about pointing out every mistake or holding yourself to impossible standards. It's about understanding, seeing your behavior without distortion, recognizing where you acted with intention and where you drifted into automatic responses. Because once you see those patterns, you have something to work with, something you can adjust. There's a difference between judging yourself and observing yourself. Judgment creates pressure. It leads to frustration, to discouragement, to the feeling that you're falling short. Observation, on the other hand, creates awareness. It allows you to notice what's happening without immediately attaching a negative meaning to it. And that distinction is what makes reflection useful instead of overwhelming. As this practice becomes more consistent, you begin to notice certain themes, moments where your focus weakens, situations that trigger hesitation or distraction, patterns that repeat across different days. These aren't random, they're signals, indicators of where your discipline holds and where it starts to break. And once you recognize them, you can begin to respond differently. This is where small adjustments come in. Not drastic changes, not complete overhauls, but subtle shifts. Choosing to handle a familiar situation slightly differently, staying present a little longer, following through when you might have drifted before. These changes don't feel significant in isolation, but over time they reshape your behavior. Carl Jung captured this process clearly when he said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." That awakening isn't dramatic, it's gradual. It happens through repeated moments of awareness, through consistently turning your attention inward, not to overanalyze, but to understand. And in that understanding you begin to see how your actions are shaped. This awareness also creates a sense of continuity. Instead of each day feeling separate, disconnected from the last, they begin to link together. What you notice today informs how you act tomorrow. What you adjust tomorrow influences what happens next, and that continuity strengthens your discipline, because you're no longer starting from zero each day. You're building on what you've already observed. At the same time, this process requires honesty, not harshness, but clarity, the ability to see things as they are, without minimizing or exaggerating, to acknowledge where you followed through and where you didn't, without turning it into a story about your worth. Because reflection isn't about who you are, it's about what you do, and what you do can always be adjusted. Over time, this practice becomes less about reviewing your entire day and more about staying aware throughout it. The reflection doesn't just happen at the end, it begins to happen in real time. You notice when you're drifting, you recognize when you're about to act out of habit instead of intention. And that awareness allows you to adjust immediately rather than waiting until later. This shift makes discipline more fluid, less reactive. You're not constantly correcting yourself after the fact. You're guiding your actions as they happen, and that reduces the gap between intention and behavior. It keeps you aligned more consistently. This doesn't mean every day becomes perfect. It doesn't. There will still be moments where you drift, where you react, where you don't follow through as you intended. But those moments don't define the entire day anymore. They become part of a process, something you notice, understand, and adjust from. That perspective reduces pressure, because you're no longer expecting perfection. You're focusing on progress, on awareness, on gradual improvement. And that focus makes discipline more sustainable. It removes the need for constant intensity and replaces it with consistency. As this practice continues, you begin to see yourself more clearly, not just your actions, but the patterns behind them, the tendencies that shape your decisions, the triggers that influence your behavior. And with that clarity, your ability to respond improves. You're no longer guessing why something happened. You understand it. And that understanding allows you to act with more intention, to make choices that align more closely with what you've already recognized as important. This also strengthens your sense of control, not over external events, but over your internal responses, because the more you understand your patterns, the less they control you. You're not acting unconsciously, you're choosing, and that choice, repeated over time, becomes the foundation of discipline, not something forced, but something developed, built through awareness, reinforced through reflection, and maintained through consistency. In the end, reflection isn't about looking back for the sake of it. It's about using what you see to move forward more clearly, to refine your actions, to strengthen your alignment, and to ensure that each day contributes, even in small ways, to the direction you've chosen. Over time, something begins to settle into place, and it's not what most people expect. Discipline stops feeling like something you have to fight for. It stops feeling like constant resistance, like you're always pushing against yourself just to stay on track. Instead, it starts to feel quieter, more stable, less like effort and more like alignment. Not because things suddenly become easy, but because your actions and your values are no longer pulling in opposite directions. That difference changes everything. When there's misalignment, every action feels heavier than it should. You hesitate more. You negotiate with yourself more. You start strong, then fade. Not because you're incapable, but because part of you isn't fully committed to the direction you're moving in. There's friction, and that friction builds over time, making consistency harder to maintain. But when alignment is present, that friction begins to fade. You're no longer forcing yourself into actions that don't resonate with what you actually value. You're not trying to convince yourself every step of the way. The decision has already been made at a deeper level, and because of that, following through becomes more natural, not effortless, but steady. This is where discipline shifts from something external to something internal. It's no longer about rules you impose on yourself. It's about a structure you've built within yourself. a way of operating that holds, even when your mood changes, even when circumstances become uncertain. And that structure doesn't rely on intensity, it relies on clarity and repetition. Motivation becomes less important here, not because it disappears, but because it's no longer necessary for action. You don't wait to feel ready, you don't depend on inspiration to begin. You act because you've already decided what matters, and that decision carries more weight than any temporary feeling. This doesn't mean you never experience resistance. You do. There are still moments where things feel difficult, where the easier option is appealing. But those moments don't derail you in the same way. They don't create the same level of internal conflict. Because your direction is clear. And when direction is clear, decisions become simpler. There's a kind of confidence that develops here. Not the kind that seeks attention, but something quieter, more grounded. You trust your ability to continue even when things aren't ideal. You trust the process you've built because you've seen it hold over time. And that trust removes a lot of the uncertainty that usually interrupts progress. You're no longer starting from zero each day. You're building on something consistent, something that doesn't depend on how you feel when you wake up. And that continuity creates momentum. Not fast, not dramatic, but steady. The kind that doesn't collapse when things get difficult. Marcus Aurelius captured this idea in a way that still resonates. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. There's a simplicity in that. A shift away from thinking, debating and analyzing toward acting in alignment with what you already understand to be right. And that shift removes a lot of unnecessary complexity. As this becomes more consistent, your relationship with discipline changes completely. It's no longer something you admire from a distance or struggle to maintain. It becomes part of how you operate, something integrated into your daily life rather than something you have to constantly think about. You begin to notice that your actions require less effort to initiate. Not because they're easier, but because there's less hesitation, less internal debate. You've reduced the gap between intention and action to the point where movement feels more direct, and that directness creates efficiency. There's also a sense of ownership that comes with this. You're no longer reacting to circumstances as much. You're not waiting to see what happens before deciding how to act. You're choosing your direction, and your actions follow that choice. And that shift creates a different experience of life, one where you feel more in control, even when external things remain unpredictable. This doesn't remove challenges, it changes how you engage with them. You're not thrown off course as easily. You adjust, you continue, but your foundation remains intact. And that stability is what allows you to keep moving forward without constantly resetting. At the same time, this way of operating creates a kind of freedom, not from responsibility, but from unnecessary struggle. You're no longer caught in cycles of starting and stopping, of building momentum only to lose it again. You've created something that sustains itself through consistency and alignment. And once you experience that, it becomes difficult to go back. Not because you can't, but because you see the difference clearly. You recognize what it feels like to act with intention instead of reaction, to move forward without constant resistance, to maintain direction even when things aren't ideal. That awareness changes your standards. You no longer settle for temporary bursts of discipline followed by long periods of inconsistency. You aim for something steadier, something more reliable, and that shift in expectation reinforces the structure you've built. Over time, this becomes your default. Not something you switch on and off, but something that remains in place. You don't need to constantly remind yourself what to do. You've already internalized it. And that internalization is what makes discipline sustainable. There's also a deeper sense of meaning that comes with this, because your actions are no longer random or reactive. They're connected, aligned with what you value. And that alignment creates a sense of purpose that doesn't depend on external outcomes. you begin to feel that your days are building towards something. Not in a dramatic way, but in a consistent one. Each action contributes, each decision reinforces your direction, and that accumulation creates progress that feels real. In the end, discipline stops being something you chase. It becomes something you embody, not perfectly, not without effort, but consistently enough that it shapes how you move through life. And in that consistency, you find something most people are still searching for. Not control over everything, but control over yourself. At the end of it all, what you're really building isn't just discipline. It's a way of standing steady in a world that constantly tries to pull you in every direction. A way of thinking clearly when things get loud, acting with intention when it would be easier not to, and staying aligned with who you're becoming, even when no one else sees it. If this resonated with you, there's another video on your screen right now that goes even deeper into this path. Take a step further into it.